right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Really honored and excited to have Julie Gardner here today. Julie is an educational specialist from Kennedy Krieger Institute, and I'm going to tell you all about her in 1 second, but I'm just going to say today our topic is empowering the parent's voice in the IEP process. Julie and I go way back, I guess not that long ago, but 5 or 6 years ago. And we worked together on a couple of supporting a couple of kids who'd had hemispherectomy, and I just am so impressed by her. She's a wealth of knowledge and far more skilled than I am. So I invited her to come and speak to you all about some sort of educational topic, and she chose this one, which I thought was a great topic to choose. If everyone could just not, could you mute, please? Someone is unmuted. Thank you. All right, and so about Julie. Julie, like I said, she's an educational specialist at Kennedy Krieger Institute. If you don't know about Kennedy Krieger Institute as a parent who's had of a child who's had epilepsy surgery, you should. So just go look it up. I think the program is called the Transition Program, Julie? Specialized Transition Program, or STP. Yeah, that program a number of our families have gone through, and you can look that up. I'll send a link when I send the follow-up materials as well. Julie has a BA in elementary education and specific learning disabilities from Flagler College, and an MA in varying exceptionalities from, well, I love that, by the way, University of South Florida. And she's currently in the Ed.D program at Slippery Rock University. And she has over 30 years of experience in special education, including private and public sectors. She's worked as an administrator and an IEP chair in public and private schools, and she's the co-owner of JNA Educational Consulting, which provides consultation and advocacy services to families involved in the general and special education system. So take it away, Julie. And a little bit of housekeeping. Please stay muted the entire time, and at the end, if we have an open up for Q&A, we may unmute, but everyone please remain muted. Put your questions in the chat, and I will be monitoring the chat, and take it away.
Thank you, Audrey. And that was a very nice introduction. I appreciate it. So thank you guys for letting me be here. This is one area that is I'm passionate about it. I feel like parents need to know what to say and when to say it at IEP meetings. So hopefully at the end of this, we'll be able to have a little bit more structure in terms of what the best thing is to say when the schools are telling you things that either you don't agree with, or you don't understand, or you're not sure if you agree with or if you understand. So one of the things that I really tell the families that I work with through Kennedy Krieger, but then also through our consulting business, is that there are 3 things that every parent needs before they walk into an IEP meeting, and that's to be prepared, to understand exactly what's going to happen, what the purpose of the meeting is, to be knowledgeable, not only about your own child, but then also about what things are going to be coming up at the meeting so that you're ready, and then be confident, because I always tell parents that I work with, you guys are the only ones that don't have a legal obligation at that table. So you can say what you need to say about your child and say it in a way that you are heard at the table. And so hopefully, as we go through this, I'm going to talk a little bit about the law, but then also about what you can say in a way that is maybe a little bit more approachable. So a big thing that educators love to do is, and I just came out of a meeting where they were doing this, is they love to throw around all of the educational jargon. Probably a lot of the folks on the call today know a bit of these that are listed, but it's important to know when they're saying that we think your child needs an FBA or a BIP. What does that mean? What are they actually saying? And do you agree with it? So these are just some of the most common ones. I think sort of my favorite one for families is this one right down here, an IEE, and we're going to learn a little bit more about an IEE and why and when to ask for that and why they're important. Here are a couple of, I'm going to have a bunch of pro tips for us today. So these are things that you're going to get when Audrey sends out the slideshow at the end of this. But these are a couple of websites that I love to tell parents to go to, because these are going to include all of those acronyms and then explain what they are. So these are 2 really good. I like the dictionary one personally. So those are things that you guys can check out after the talk or before you go to your next meeting. So we're going to get into it. So Audrey did such a great job. I love that I was able to sit in on the dissection of the IEP. So if you go back to your notes for the dissection IEP of the IEP, then I'm going to go literally in the same order that Audrey went. So looking at referral and eligibility, and I know on your screens, this is probably really tiny. So again, when you get your handout at the end of this, it'll be a little bit more accessible to you. But one thing that I find when I go into IEP meetings a lot of times, especially because I work in a hospital setting, is that schools will automatically dismiss everything that your physicians or that your outside medical providers have offered. And they'll say, well, that's a medical issue and we are a school and we don't have to listen to them because they're medical and we're educational. Now, the first thing I always say to schools when they say that are, well, first of all, he's a whole person. The child is a whole person. They're not just medical when they're at the hospital and educational when they're here. So when we look at what the law says for referring your child to special education, and this goes for reevaluations as well, is they need to do what the law says, which is to look at your child from all different areas. So that's functional, developmental, and academic, as well as information provided by the family. So when you're bringing in your medical documentation to the school, that is part of what the law says is what they have to look at in terms of eligibility and referral. And that they don't use any single assessment or measurement to determine eligibility or re-eligibility or to do eligibility when they're just trying to update the IEP. So these are some important parts of this particular part of the law that do speak to what your medical doctors or your outside therapist or your audiologist or what any of those folks are saying. This part of the law speaks to exactly why the school needs to review that documentation. The assessments need to be done by a trained and knowledgeable person, and they need to be valid and reliable for the purpose of the assessment. So what does that mean, really? Audrey mentioned this in one of her talks in the last couple of weeks, that the assessments that are done for children for eligibility have to be done by somebody who's trained to assess children with complex medical needs. That's not typically the school system, right? That's not typically the school teachers. That's not typically the folks that are working in the schools. So if you feel like there's a specific nuanced piece of your child's medical history that needs to be assessed, this is the kind of the law that you can pull out and say, this is the reason why I need you to review the outside documentation.
Julie, can I interrupt for a second? I'm sorry. The question I get all the time is, well, how do we get that? So I hear you're now going to talk about outside documentation, but are you going to go into what to do if the parent hasn't been able to obtain a decent outside evaluation either, because that also can be an issue for our kids because of their complexity, and how to hold the district accountable and what that would look like? Are you going to discuss that at all?
Yep. Because so yeah. So if we're talking about specific, are you talking about like what assessment are you talking about exactly?
Well, you talked about how the school is if they're not qualified to do that comprehensive look at the child, that they would then look at the medical documentation, I think was where you were going.
Right.
But sometimes we find that even the medical documentation for these kiddos, because of their complexity, is not sufficient. So sometimes we have an audiologist that it takes a child who has a hemispherectomy or temporal lobectomy and says he hears fine because they don't understand central auditory processing disorder. Or a lot, I see families trying to get an autism diagnosis, and there are clinical psychologists who won't diagnose a child with autism who's had brain surgery because for some reason in their minds they think they're mutually exclusive, that kind of thing. So a lot of times parents are even fighting to get their private providers to provide an appropriate evaluation. So I think it's just saying, well, have your private provider submit documentation and the school needs to consider it. I feel like we need to go a little further than that.
Right.
We don't have to address this today if it's not part of your presentation, but I just want to make sure those of you who are listening, it might not be you might need more than both a good school evaluation and a good outside evaluation, and really making sure that you're articulating what the child's needs are.
Right. So exactly what you said in your presentation about the evaluation needs to be done in all areas of suspected disability. So if you have a child with the hemispherectomy, we suspect that they're going to have central auditory processing deficits. And then the other part of the law says that the assessment has to be selected and administered so that it's the assessment results accurately reflect the child's achievement level rather than reflecting the child's impaired sensory, speaking, or manual hearing skills. So what does that mean? What that means is that you have to make sure that the person who is administering the evaluation understands the disability so that they can measure the skill that they're trying to measure, not the auditory processing deficit. Does that make sense? Or the central auditory processing deficit. So if you have an audiologist through the school system and who doesn't understand hemispherectomy, that's not the appropriate person to administer this assessment. And that's sort of your like kingpin in there to say, this is why we need this outside assessment. This is why the school system should pay for it. And this is why you need to accept the results. Does that answer your question, Audrey?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay, so here, so then on my next slide, I say, well, what do you say? And this is exactly what I would say. All areas of my child's suspected disability should be evaluated to determine eligibility. That's the first thing that I always tell parents to say, because a lot of times schools don't suspect areas of disability because they didn't understand the disability to begin with. Right? So they need to understand what happens when a child has a hemispherectomy, for example, or what happens when a child has a seizure disorder, or what happens when a child has autism. They have to understand at the very core what the disability is so that we can find the trained and qualified personnel to assess them. So then we can say, okay, then who in your district is qualified to assess a child with this diagnosis? Right? I work with a lot of kids with traumatic brain injury. A lot of times the school psychologist is not the appropriate person to assess a person with a traumatic brain injury. So then I say to them, well, if you don't have anybody in the district to do it that's appropriately trained and qualified, and you can ask for their qualifications and their training, then you can say, this is why I need an independent educational evaluation, and I need a list of places that are appropriate for my child. And that might be an institute like Kennedy or wherever, depending on what state you're in. There's probably a hospital in the area that has somebody who's qualified to do that.
There's a question in the chat. And again, I think this is going to get a little complex and it's really hard with kind of the more personalized questions, but it goes back to what I was just asking, which this parent is saying, we're struggling with the auditory processing and neuropsychological eval through insurance. So can you talk about when parents should be required to use insurance and when the school district is obligated to provide those evaluations at district expense?
I actually was just reading about this last night. Is one of the things that the law says is that you are allowed to ask for one assessment every time your school, an outside assessment, when your school is recommending the evaluation. So if you're in the evaluation period, you feel like your child needs to be evaluated in a certain area, the school system has a right to say, first, we can do it, right? We have to do it first. Then the family can say, we disagree with that. That's when you can get the outside ed eval at the school's expense. It does not have to go through your insurance. I do IEEs all the time through Kennedy Krieger, that it does not go through the family's insurance. It goes through the public school system.
And can I just go ahead?
That's okay. I was just going to say, but it has to, but you can't ask for, you can't do an outside ed eval, disagree with the results and ask for another one, right? So it's a one-to-one correspondence. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So every evaluation, let's say the comprehensive evaluation in all areas of suspected disability for a child with a hemispherectomy is, central auditory processing disorder, psychoed and neuropsych, which are two different evals. Mm-hmm. The psychoed would include detailed literacy assessment, vision, including ocular, motor, visual fields, all of that, speech and language, autism, behavior, like there's a lot, right?
OTPT.
OTPT, right? Those are the basics. I always forget about those. Mental health, like does the child need school-based counseling because they feel, frustrated and different than their peers, et cetera. So the district has the obligation to do an evaluation that encompasses all areas of suspected disability. Let's say they just do 2 of those and they don't do the rest. You can ask for an evaluation for each area that they did not assess.
Yes.
And it's not, it is an IEE at that point because you've let the district do it first. You've said, okay, you go ahead and do your comprehensive eval. Well, you missed like 10 out of 12. So we're going to now ask you for an IEE in these 10 areas. And then what the district will do is they'll say, here's our list of providers, which you do not need to choose from, but they often have a list. And then that's where you do your due diligence and say, I called all these providers. None of them have ever heard of part of the brain being removed and how that would impact my child's auditory processing. So I need someone who's not on this list. And by the way, your cap of, $1,500 is unreasonable because the person who's an expert in this actually charges $6,000 for this evaluation, right? So there's a lot of negotiation. I'm thinking maybe at some point we should do a power hour on this process
Yes.
back and forth, because I've gone back and forth with a lot of parents about this.
Yeah.
You can use your insurance to obtain an evaluation, but you don't have to, because the district actually is obligated to evaluate your child in all areas of suspected disability.
Right.
And it's just a matter of finding that qualified person to do it.
Yes.
I can take that question offline. I'll come back back to that.
And the thing to be careful about too is if you are seeking evaluations prior to the school's conversation about those evaluations, it's much harder to get them to agree to the results, right? If they've agreed to pay for it, you say, I want the IEE, they've agreed to pay for it. It's much easier to get them to then accept the results. Because, outside providers who do these kinds of evaluations, I'll have a conversation with the school system sometimes and say, I'm thinking about doing this set of this battery of protocols. What are you going to accept the Woodcock-Johnson versus the Wyatt, for example? And sometimes you can have that conversation as a provider and say, look, I've looked through this child's medical record and their educational records, and these are the evaluations I'm going to propose that I'm going to be doing. They may say, well, can you switch out the Woodcock-Johnson for the Wyatt, which are just 2 achievement tests? And I can say yes. And then that way it's a much smoother transition. So when the school gets the report, you get the report, they accept the results a lot easier. So think about that too. Is ask your provider, your outside provider, can you have a conversation before we do this evaluation so that when we get to the table, they're going to accept your results. Okay.
Yep.
I'm happy to do that when I do that for outside ed evals, because it just makes it easier on the family at the end of the day. So one thing that I find, so we're back to talking about eligibility and getting assessments, the assessments that you want. The person at the table who's absolutely my favorite person to listen to is that general ed teacher. And I'll tell you why, because when you're sitting at the table and the special ed teacher and the audiologist is saying, well, we don't think that he has central auditory processing deficits. We don't suspect that as part of his disability. But the general ed teacher is sitting there and you say, well, tell me about the last time you were at an assembly. How did my child behave? Was he covering his ears? When you're talking in class, is he looking at you when he's talking? When you get that general ed teacher talking, the general ed teacher doesn't know all the rules generally, so they're the ones that are going to give the information. And I feverishly take notes while that general ed teacher is talking. Because remember, what we're doing is we're trying to build a program for your child to meet general ed requirements, right? So if that general ed teacher is saying, well, I'm constantly telling your daughter to pay attention in class. I'm constantly, whenever things get a little bit noisy in class, it looks like she's lost and she doesn't know what to do. I'm constantly reminding her to put her belongings away. Whatever the teacher is saying about your child, that general ed teacher, that's where you know what? She had a hysterectomy. That makes sense to me. It makes sense to me that she's not able to remember, step A, B, and C, or whatever it is that you're trying to get the assessment for. But the general ed teacher is the one who most often is going to give you the information that you need to say, you see that? That's why I want the evaluation, because I suspect that her disability is impacting her in the general ed classroom. Does that make sense? Is that making sense to people? So I always say, let that person talk as much as possible, take some notes, and then it's kind of, you can say, let me connect that back to their disability, and let me explain to you why we need an evaluation in that area, or why we need goals in that area, or why we need whatever. A lot of times what happens is, you go to an IEP meeting and the first person they want to dismiss is they say, well, Miss, Jones needs to get back because she's a general ed teacher. Can we excuse her and let her go back to class? I see parents say all the time, oh yeah, that's fine. We don't really need her. And I'm like, but back up. We need her at the table almost more than anybody, because our goal is general education, right? We're comparing where our child is to where the general ed class is. Not that they can do better than everybody else, not, where they are among other kids, but where is he or she functioning within the general ed curriculum? And you need the general ed teacher to be able to speak to that. So I would say, if they ask you to excuse the general ed teacher, do not do it. That's the person that you need at the table. And there's a website down here at the bottom that sort of speaks to excusal from meeting, why we don't want to do that. We don't want to excuse people from meetings.
Can I jump in there just one more time? A lot of times what I see with our kids is they'll send the PE teacher to be the general ed teacher. So then you're asking that PE teacher a lot of questions. How does my child behave in your class? Well, it's PE. Okay, great. Do they follow instructions? Do they ever get injured? Do people bump into them?
Right.
do they participate with the rest of their peers? Are they off in another room or off to the side with a para? How engaged are they? Are they able, do they remember from one day to the next, if you're building a unit on a specific, skill in PE, how is that going, right? Like, don't just let the person sit there and say nothing. If that's the only gen ed person you're getting, you want to really understand, how does my child engage in that gen ed setting, which might be their only gen ed setting all day, which is fine. There's not a problem with that. That's not necessarily a problem, right? But just to make sure that you're asking those questions and getting as much out of that as possible. I'll stop interrupting so much.
No, you're totally fine. No, I like it. I agree with you. Like, if the specials is where your child is integrated with general ed students, then that's just as important. There's content and curriculum markers for those classes as well. And you need that's part of the curriculum. Your child needs to be included in all of that. So yes, I 100% agree. And again, the general ed teacher, like I said, they're always my favorite. So moving on to the parent input statement. So this is the part of the law that talks about how important it is for the family to not just show up to the meetings, but to be an active participant in your child's IEP. And by active participant, that means equal partner and equal input. This is one area, again, that I see a lot of times where schools sort of gloss over the family input, and the only time you're allowed to speak is when they get to that one section in the IEP that says parent input statement, and they say, okay, you have 30 seconds, go ahead and tell us how you think about your child's educational placement. I always ask my parents to please write this before the meeting. Write down everything you can think of, just like the present level for academics that the teachers are responsible for. This is kind of your present level of where you sort of state of the union, where do you see your child's current educational program, and what do you want for your child in the coming year? I think it's really important for families to think about this ahead of time, because when you're put on the spot like that, you always forget the things that are important, or you don't have enough time to really put together a thought. I always tell families this should be the first thing read at the meeting. So I would say, before we get started, let's go ahead and I would like to read my parent statement, and then highlight in your parent statement things that are most important to you, your highest priorities for the year. So at the end of the meeting, we're going to talk about how do we get those things addressed. But this is the part of the law that really talks about you are a part of every single step of this process, from identification to placement. And from reevaluation, your participation in the meeting is vital. And when schools run over a parent, it makes me insane. So what I want for you guys is, anytime they say any of these things over here, your parent input statement is too long. I was in a meeting last week and they said, well, we only get 75 characters in our program to put in parent input statements. And I thought, the child's name is almost 75 characters long. Like, we can't. So I said, well, how do we amend this IEP so that this parent can get their entire statement included in its entirety? So one thing that you can say is, I'm always very collaborative. I value your perspective. However, I want to be heard. And that's one thing that you can say at a meeting. I tell parents all the time, you need to say the words, I want to be heard, because that kind of puts everybody on notice that you really are an equal part of this team. And so saying that, and then say you want to have your parent statement, included without edit. And it's important to say that, so that, especially if you're in a recorded meeting and your parent statement gets edited, that you have said, I wanted this in there without edit. And that's really important to keep a record of what your wishes are as part of the IEP. And also, I say this as an educational specialist who goes to lots of meetings. Families often will have advocates at the meetings, which I think are fantastic. I work with a ton of great advocates across the country, but they often will focus on the process and the procedures, right? You have very unique children in this setting in particular. I think every child's pretty unique, but you want somebody at that table, if you're not able to speak to all of your child's areas of concern, or if you get nervous in meetings, that you can bring somebody who can speak on you and your child's behalf, and they need to be heard as well. As long as they have unique knowledge of your child, right? They understand the disability. They understand your family's, personal situation, and they can speak to that at the meeting. Things like that. So those people also need to have a moment to speak. as an educational specialist, I've had schools say, well, we can only listen to the family. We can't have any input from anybody outside of the family. That's not true. If you bring somebody who has knowledge of your child or that can help you at the meeting, that person needs to be heard as well. If for some reason they disagree with you, or they don't want to include it, or they tell you that your parent statement's too long, or it's irrelevant, or they don't want to hear it, then have them document in the prior written notice that there's a reason why your parent statement can't be included. Just say, you know what, that's okay. It's only 75 characters. Can you put that in the prior written notice that you refuse to include my parent statement in its entirety because it's too long, or whatever reason they give you. This is my favorite thing to tell parents to say at a meeting. One of my favorite is, you don't always want to get into an argument about everything, but when they refuse to do something you've asked, an outside assessment, including your parent statement, just say, can you put that in the prior written notice at the end of the meeting that you're refusing to do X, Y, and Z? Lots of times that changes their mind about refusal because they don't want to put in print why they're refusing to do something. And that includes your parent statement. So going back to your parent statement, if you've written it ahead of time, you want to highlight your areas of concern. And then before you walk out the door, you go back to your parent statement and you say, okay, so there were these 3 things that I highlighted that I want to make sure get addressed today. Before we leave, I want to make sure those things have been addressed. And they might agree with them. Maybe they say, yep, we agreed to all 3 of them. They're in the IEP and you're in agreement with that and everybody's happy. If they don't, again, you're going to put it in that prior written notice, the reason for refusal. And then here's the website that talks about parent permission or parent participation, at an IEP. Okay. Present levels. This is the hill that I will die on in every single IEP meeting. I'm telling you right now, the present level, lots of times the present level goes through everything from the health of your child, behavior, reading, writing, math, auditory, all of those different areas. And every one of those areas in your present level need to be addressed. So your child, and I always say start with the medical, but then a lot of times schools, they just want to include what your child cannot do. They just want to say, he can't read, he can't walk, he can't do this, he can't do that. That does not tell us as an IEP team what your child can do, and it doesn't paint a picture of the whole child. And that's what the present level is really supposed to be doing. And the reason for that is because later on in the IEP, we look at the present level to determine goals. We look at the present level to determine accommodations. We go back to that present level to determine just about everything else in the IEP. So I always say, spend time on this present level. Make sure that all areas have been addressed and make sure that all areas include both your child's strengths and your weaknesses, his weaknesses, and how this disability is affecting their access to general ed curriculum. Because again, that's the whole point of special education, right? So we want to make sure that this present level is as comprehensive as it can get, so that when we get to goals, the goal writing just starts to make sense, because you're like, oh, okay, well, he can do A, B, and C, but he can't do D, E, and F. That's the goal, right? That's how you develop these goals. If your present level, a lot of times schools will say, well, present levels don't have to include medical because we're not doctors, but it does, because it builds the foundation for why your child can't do D, E, and F, right? If they didn't have this medical document, this medical diagnosis, if they didn't have these medical concerns, they likely wouldn't be sitting at the special ed table, right? So we want to make sure that we document all of those medical conditions that are somehow impacting their academics. And I say there's a little health and medical section in the present levels. Let's fill that out and make sure that the folks that are filling it out really are understanding what those diagnoses mean. A lot of times they just cut and paste from a medical document and nobody reads it and nobody understands what it means anyway. So then we say, let's stop for a second. Let's have, if your nursing supervisor is there, let's have her explain it. If she can't explain it to your team, let's have somebody from the outside come in and do a training and explain it. So that then we can say, oh, okay, well, now I understand why you're saying this child might have central auditory processing deficits, but they didn't know what that meant. They didn't understand that that diagnosis meant that this is very likely going to impact them in school. So then I always say to the families, again, we want to start off with the appreciation for what they're doing. We appreciate that you're telling me what my child can't do. But I want to know what my child can do and how they are accessing that general ed curriculum. That is, just keep going back to that. How are they accessing the curriculum? And if they can't, for some reason, access the curriculum, how are we addressing that in the IEP? You always want to include your child's strengths, and then you want to know what their understanding is of how your child's disability affects his or her progress in the curriculum. That's the most important thing. That is the core purpose of special education. And then I just listed sort of the areas that we want to include in the present levels, and including mental and physical health. A lot of times they don't want to address mental health in the schools, but if your child is struggling with some mental health issues related to the disability that's impacting them in the school, and that could be anxiety, that could be any level of mental health issues, we want to make sure that we're addressing that in school, because they don't check their mental health at the front door when they come into school. That's a part of who they are during the day.
There's a question, Julie, in the chat, and I'm not sure if this is the right time or if we want to circle back on it, but just about the difference between a neuropsychological evaluation and a psychological or a psycho ed. And I know it's a big topic and we might not have time to get into it, but I just want to put it out there and see if you want to touch on this now or come back to this after you finish your presentation.
Just briefly, a neuropsych is going to talk about the students of how they learn, how they access knowledge, and they're going to talk about things like processing speed and visual spatial relations and things like that. Psycho ed is really going to be more understanding how they are achieving, so how their psychological profile is affecting their actual achievement in class. So it's going to look more at like reading, writing, and math. It's going to include that reading, writing, and math, where a neuropsych, typically they don't even address that. They're going to look at neurobehavior status. They're going to look at thinking skills and things like that, and psychosocial skills and things like that. So that's kind of the big separator, is that the psycho ed is going to include the achievement piece as well. It goes into a little less of the brain-based stuff. I would say that most folks that are on the call today, they probably want to be looking at having both done, a neuropsych eval, a complete neuropsych eval done, and then also an educational evaluation. I like to see them stand alone. And then you need somebody that can analyze those results and synthesize that information for your team.
And there's another question, which is a great one. Sorry. The present levels is written by the school, yes?
No.
If they leave off motor functional health, how do we ask them to put that in there, or do we do that together? So is the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance written by the school team, Julie?
No part of this IEP is written by the school team only. You are a full and complete participant as the parent on the IEP team. So yes, they can draft the present levels for reading, writing, and math. They can draft, present levels for whatever areas they want to. Certainly they have input, but then you can round out the information by saying, you know what, let's also talk about these other areas. So yeah, going back to the present levels, you can say, oh, thank you for that information, but I think we left off some really important areas. So let's talk about health. Let's talk about medical. And I'd like to see that included as part of the present levels. So absolutely. And if your child has complex medical needs, you can work with your outside providers to write a present level for their medical status. Or if you're working with a therapist for their mental health status, you can work with your outside providers and have that done before the meeting and bring that or share that as a draft prior to the meeting. Kennedy, we do a lot where we provide statements where I'll say, this is what I see them as their present level in this area. And then the family takes it to the meeting and says, I'd like to have this included. Now the school might say, okay, well, that doesn't completely address their in-school behaviors or their in-school functioning, and they can tweak it and you can work as a team. But I think always coming to the table with a draft is super helpful, because then you're not just starting from a blank sheet of paper.
Yeah. And I'll just add that when I did the anatomy of the IEP over the past 2 weeks, which took 2+ sessions to get through because there was so much, I did share parent input statement examples for every part of the IEP. So you can write a statement for every single section of the present levels and ask the team to include it in the IEP. And if they say no, then they would be violating parent participation, which is a very important part of the law. And you could ask them to provide prior written notice of why they are not allowing you to provide your parent input into your child's IEP. So the team does not write the IEP. You are the school team, sorry, the IEP team writes the IEP. And you as a parent are an integral part of the IEP team. Your voice has to be there.
Yeah. I've been at IEP meetings where they write in the prior written notice, the school team feels this way, the families team feels this way. And I always have to fix that and say, we are all on the same team for this particular student. So it's not an us against them. It is definitely a consensus. And there are sometimes that we say, you know what, your priorities are a little bit different than what the family's priorities are. And we try to come to consensus on that, but it is not their team versus your team. Audrey and I have talked a lot. We're probably going to do this later in the year. We could do a whole series on goal writing and goal monitoring. But one of the best or one of the most frequent things that I hear about goals is, again, here to your point, I don't know which parent that was, but that parents aren't allowed to have or write or have input into their goals. Parents very much can. And I've worked with lots of parents to actually write the goals that wind up in their IEP because schools were not able to write good goals. Absolutely, you have input into the goal writing. Absolutely, you have input into the areas of goals that you want included in the IEP. The best way to do that is to ask your school for their core content standards and look and see what the standards are for your child's grade, and then kind of map that onto what your child's skills are, and then talk with them about how do I get my child from where they are to what this content standard is. And that's really their job to write the goals, right? But if you know what those content standards are for if your child's in the 5th grade and you know what the content standards are, then you know what direction to go in terms of writing those goals. So that's really important to educate yourself on what are the standards. A lot of times I work with families and they have older children or they have younger children and they don't really know what is grade level standard. And the schools a lot of time will say, oh, Susie's doing great. She's making such great progress. But what I find is that the academic standard is here and Susie's doing this, but she's not closing the gap in any way. And we're going to talk about why that's so important in a minute. But so you really want to know that the school's responsibility is to share that your child's making progress towards goals. They should do that at least as often as they give report cards to general education students. You can ask for that to happen more often. I often do ask for that more often than just here in Maryland, it's once every 9 weeks. For some kids, I have progress monitoring done every 4.5 weeks. So every interim report, we get an update on IEP goals because a lot of the kids I work with change quite dramatically. They don't love it, but we're not here to make everybody happy. We're just here to make sure that our students are making progress. Another one of my big issues is there's no decent baseline data. And again, that's in that present level of performance. You want to make sure that that is as robust as possible so that on the first day of the IEP that where your student is and how they're making progress. I've heard this at more than one meeting where the school says, I can't give you any progress monitoring because your child refuses to perform for me when it's my time to work with your child. So the special ed teacher comes in between 10 and 10:15 in the morning. And for some reason, your child isn't able to do that particular skill between 10 and 10:15 in the morning. So they say, we don't have any data and it's your child's fault. I've heard that so many times at IEP meetings. I just want to scream. So what do you say to that? This is what you say to that. It seems that if my child appears unmotivated or only wants to do preferred activities, perhaps we can assess that through a functional behavior assessment. So if you're saying to me that my child's behavior is so impactful that you're unable to do what you need to do with my child, then we need to look at that through a functional behavior assessment. Or you can switch the time that you work with my child, right? So that your child isn't on the spot at 10 o'clock in the morning to do math, because that may not be when your child is available for that instruction. So we need to be able to talk to them in a way with schools in a way that they're thinking about things a little bit more flexibly than this is the only time I have to work with your child and they better put on a good performance for me or I don't have any data for you. That's not how this program is supposed to work.
Julie, there's a good question about this in the chat, which is we changed from 12 weeks to 6 weeks on goals, but I still feel like that means they only quote unquote test that skill on particular dates to write the progress report rather than work on it each week. And I see this a lot as well. So that's why I think you go back to the goal writing itself, right? They like to write things like 3 out of 4 times or, whatever, so that they don't have to do it as often, and how often they're collecting data. So this is a conversation to have, I think, with the IEP team. But Julie, I'd love to hear what your response would be to that. If they're now reporting in 6-week increments instead of 12 weeks, but they're only testing the skill on certain dates just to write the progress report.
Yes. So then what I do is I develop data collection sheets, or I ask them to say, can I see your data collection sheets and can I see when you work on this skill? Because you're right, if it's a 6-week goal and they say your child will do X, Y, and Z 5 times across 6 weeks, what we don't want to see is that once a week, right? That's when they're testing the skill. Now, there are some things, it depends, and I'm not sure what skill you're talking about with your child, but it depends on what the skill is, right? Some things you do work on every day: reading, writing, math. You should be working on every single day. And maybe every Friday they do sort of a 1-minute probe of the math skills. And they say, yep, she was able to do it. And that's where we're going to take the data. That could make sense, right? If you work on multiplication all week, on Fridays, you do that 1-minute probe. We take the data and we say, yep, she's done it. So we're going to do that across 5 weeks. And we can say consistently across 5 weeks, she's done her math skills 80% of the time. That might be okay, but it depends on what the skill is, right? If it's a functional skill, that's something you'd want to work on every day.
So another parent, and I've actually spoken to this parent, so I know a little backstory. She said, I often hear that goal was not targeted during this progress reporting period. And if I remember correctly, this mom reached out to me last year. There were goals that there was no progress reported on for an entire quarter or even a semester, because they said, well, we didn't work on it. And it's like, how can that be a good IEP goal if they don't even need to work on it? If it's a skill that doesn't need to be addressed for that long, why is it even an IEP goal? But how would you respond to that, where they're like, there's no progress reported at all in certain goal areas for an entire progress reporting period, whether it be 6, 8, 10, 12 weeks, whatever number of weeks it is, doesn't matter, but where they just don't report data on a subset of goals, saying, well, we didn't target that goal during this period.
Then you're right, it's not an appropriate goal, because I would go back to the present levels and say, you said in the present levels that my child could not do this. That's why we developed the goal in this area. So if you're saying they can't do it, you got to do something about it. That's how I say to the schools. And you can't just put a goal on there and say, we're going to start this goal in December and it's February. If she can't start it the day after that IEP is signed, it should not be on the goal. It shouldn't be on the IEP, rather. I'm sorry. It should not be on the IEP. So if they're not reporting progress, they're denying her fate, because they're not providing the instruction that they said that they would provide. There's no reason for that. I see a lot of times where they'll write a goal and then they write the benchmarks, right? By October, she'll do this. By February, she'll do that, and so they're addressing the 4th objective by starting it in the 1st objective. Does that make sense? In the 1st quarter, they are addressing it, but that goal should be worked on as soon as that IEP is signed. There's no excuse for that.
Yeah.
There's no excuse. So when you're looking at the goals, I'm sure everybody's heard this acronym where they have SMART goals. They should be specific and measurable and achievable and realistic and timely. So those are kind of the benchmarks for what is a good goal. But it used to be that was good enough, that the goal just had to give them adequate access to education. Now, SMART goals have to be more than SMART. They have to be what's called ambitious. And so what we're talking about with these goals, and again, I hope Audrey and I really can do a whole thing on goals later in the year, is that the goals, it isn't good enough for your children just to make adequate progress in school. Your children should be making progress in such a way that they're closing the gap between where they started and where general ed is. If they're just moving along in the same trajectory, then they're not really ambitious goals. There are a lot of situations and a lot of students that may never be in full general ed curriculum. They may not be accessing general ed standards completely all the time, but from where they are to where you want them to be should be closing, not just staying the same. The Andrew and Douglas case, I suggest everybody look that up. That's a recent, relatively recent case that's where the Supreme Court said we need ambitious goals. Kids need to be closing that gap. I had one student that the whole year, the goal was that she would improve sight word vocabulary by 2 words each quarter. That's not ambitious in any way. So she was going to learn 8 more words across the year. Things like that are not acceptable. So back to Audrey's question or the family's question. If your child's not making, a lot of times I'll see on progress notes that for the first, second, and third quarter, the school marks making sufficient progress. And then by the fourth quarter, they say, oh, guess what? Your child didn't meet the goal. So we're just going to roll it into next year. That's not acceptable, because if your child was making sufficient progress for 3 out of 4 quarters, then the expectation is that by the fourth quarter, they would have met that goal. Unless something tragic happened in the fourth quarter and you had 12 blizzards and you never went to school, but even then they're required to provide service. So I'd really caution you guys to look closely at your quarterly progress and make sure that if they're saying that your child is making progress, they really are making progress and you can see that. And if they're not making progress, it's the school's responsibility to call you up and say, we need to have an IEP meeting. We need to talk about this goal. Your child is not making sufficient progress. We don't anticipate your child's going to meet this goal at the end of the year. And if that's the case, we need to find out why. Is it the goal was too ambitious? Is it that there's not enough support? Is it, what is it? What is the reason why my child's not making progress? And again, I just made this little checklist. If you want to have a meeting, if you can call a meeting at any point to discuss this. If you feel like your child's not making the progress that you're anticipating, I would put together a little email that has these 4 points. Make sure that you're putting the date in there, you're requesting the IEP meeting, and how many days you want to have that IEP meeting. I always tell families, give them 2 weeks. Most school systems can take up to 30 days to schedule a meeting at a parent request, but I always tell families, give them 2 weeks and see if you can get that meeting as soon as possible and email it. That way that there's a record of when you actually sent it. Services, I've searched high and low and looked at hundreds of districts across the country in terms of what does the law say about how to figure out how many minutes of therapy your child can receive or how many minutes of special ed service your child can receive. There is no, to my knowledge, there is no stated law about that. But what it does say is that it's determined by the therapist or the special ed teacher with the input of the team. And who is on the team? You are on the team. So that being said, when the physical therapist says, or rather say the speech therapist says, I think, we have 3 goals. I think I can work on all 3 of them in 10 minutes every week. And then I'll do consult for 10 minutes a week with the school teachers. So that's where you can say, you know what? I think that he probably needs more therapy, that you want to get, again, the general ed teacher. How many times are you repeating yourself to the student? Are you able to understand the student? Is it an articulation issue? And you want to get the general ed teacher talking about how much extra support are they giving your child versus other children. And that'll help kind of inform this conversation a little bit about how many minutes of therapy. That being said, if you feel at the end of this IEP, when you're getting to the services page, that you're really not getting a whole lot of therapy, I would suggest that you go back and look at those goals. Go back and say, are these goals as robust and as ambitious as they need to be? Is that why the therapist doesn't really need to spend that much time with my child because there's not that much to work on? So if that's the case and you feel like your child really needs more, go back and look at that present level, go back and look at that goal and make sure that those goals are as ambitious as you can get them. On the flip side of this, a lot of times I see where, you might have a student with speech and language needs, and they have 1 or 2 goals. And as soon as that student meets those 2 goals, the speech and language therapist wants to dismiss them, or the OT or PT or whoever it is. They say, you know what, your kid met both of my goals this year, so let's dismiss them from service. And that's when I always say, if they met those goals before the end of the year, were they not ambitious enough? Like, did we not put the bar high enough if your child meets those goals within the first quarter or two? And then if they were, then maybe it's time for a reevaluation to see if there's any other areas that were not addressed in that IEP that should be before you dismiss the service. And that's an important thing, because a lot of times I see schools all the time who want to dismiss kids from special education because they met 1 or 2 goals, and that's just not appropriate. And finally, placement. Again,
I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you really quick.
No.
Because there's 2 questions in the chat about that. So actually one is a comment, which is I've had success with adding consult time into related service to have them talk to the team and to observe in class time pushing in. So I did talk about supports for school personnel in the anatomy of the IEP, which is going to be up on YouTube if it's not already. Momentarily, I'll share that link. And so that section, there's a whole part of the IEP at the end that is the supports for the school personnel. So that's where you write, if you say, I need to meet with you every week to talk about Johnny's behavior or Johnny's reading, or John, and the teacher says, our related service provider says, I don't have time. Then you say, let's write the minutes into the IEP. And guess what? If that related service provider has X minutes per week with your child, including parent consult, teacher consult, training in the classroom, observation, and direct service with your child, that's going to affect their caseload. And the school district might need to hire another therapist to provide therapy, because that therapist is now, but if those minutes are not in the IEP, the therapist can't then say, I have too much on my caseload, because they're going to say, no, you have 27 kids or whatever they give all these therapists, right? But it actually helps the therapist. I've had therapists say, thank you for putting that in, because this is a more complex child, let's say, and I do want to document that more. So that was just feedback on that. I don't know if you have any more comments on adding consult time, and then I'll ask the second question that popped up.
Yeah, adding consult time. A lot of times the way to get that consult time in is to say, look, I know I call you every week because I want an update. Let's reflect that in the IEP. Like, let's get in the IEP what my child actually needs, because what if you leave the district? I'm still going to need that level of interaction with the therapist. So yeah, absolutely reflect if you're needing that much time with the therapist, or if the therapist is needing that much time with the classroom teacher, absolutely reflect it in an IEP.
And also if the provider needs to provide ongoing training to the staff. So for assistive technology, I always see they'll do an evaluation. They'll be like, yeah, the kid could use an iPad. They give the kid an iPad, and then you never see the assistive technology specialist again. And then you'll hear the teacher say, yeah, there was an iPad, but I couldn't figure out how to use it. And then the battery died and we put it in a drawer and we haven't looked at it since.
Right.
So there are cases where the service, like a tool without the time for training for the staff, is going to be a waste of time, right? And I see this a lot with vision as well. Like if the school's staff is not trained in the child's visual impairments ongoing, then they can't support the child, because the curriculum keeps changing, and so therefore the child. So that's really important.
One more comment about consult. You can also ask for outside providers to provide yearly consultation with your staff in terms of training.
Yeah, so private providers that may know the child better or the condition better. Yeah. And then someone asked, can each therapy area, such as speech, PT, OT, measure their time in different units? Is minutes per week defined anywhere as what it should be minutes per year? And so I did talk about this in the anatomy of the IEP. Some schools do put like 260 minutes per year. Yeah. That's fine that they want to do that. But as a parent, you can say, I just want to make sure that my child, instead of receiving 60 minutes per week, which is too much for my child to handle in one setting, that he's actually receiving 15 minutes 4 times a week of speech therapy, and 2 of those should be in group and 2 of those should be individual, or whatever it's going to be. You can still delineate all the details. But I think in terms of, do they need to write it as weekly or yearly? Do you know the answer to that, Julie?
They don't. That's up to the district. But what you can do, what Audrey's saying, is that in that comment section, that's where you want to spell out exactly what that looks like week to week. But it is district to district, whether they say he's going to get 700 minutes of special ed across the year. I've seen that. I'm like, that means nothing to me. So I want it in the comment section.
Yeah. And then there's a question about if there is consult time, parents asking, like, we had this written in, but then they didn't do it, right? So what if it says in the IEP And you all should, I mean, well, you shouldn't know anything. I'm trying to help you all understand the different ways that this process evolves, and Julie can talk about this as well. But if there is something that you disagree with that is not in the IEP, that's a due process issue. Like if you and the district are just at odds, that's where you need to go to due process or settle to come if you can't resolve it at the IEP table. But if the team has written something into the IEP and they're not doing it, that's a state complaint issue. And it's very easy to file a state complaint. It literally takes about 15 minutes. You write a statement, you attach the IEP, you send it to your state Department of Ed. Sometimes that's very unrewarding. The outcomes are different and they vary by state. It depends on how robust the state is. And it also depends on what you want the outcome or what they call the remedy to be. But Julie, how would you approach that? If there's something that's agreed to in the IEP and it's not happening, what would your strategy be to address that?
I asked them to document it. So for example, that's why I said about the data sheets. I have actually developed data sheets written in every single goal, put every single day of the month across the top. And I say, I just want you to check it off. When you work on this goal, I want you to check it off. So when I look at your data sheets, I know he worked on it 12 times and this is what his progress is.
Yeah.
In terms of your question about consult, I would say, can you just stick that in the log that, on Tuesday, I met with the special ed teacher for 15 minutes. I make charts like mad because I figure the easier it is for them to fill it out, the more likely they will do it. And so then you can say, as part of my child's IEP, I would like weekly communication. And in that communication, I would like to include, you've got to spell it out because in a lot of schools, they'll say, yeah, we'll do weekly communication. But then as soon as you ask them for, I want it to be a narrative or I want it to look like this, then that's when there starts to be a problem. So at the IEP table, I say, if I gave you a form and all you had to do was check on these boxes, is that too much? And they say, no, that's not too much. We'll do it. Great. Write that in the IEP. Parent will provide the form. The school's going to fill it out. Everybody's going to be happy. That way, when they don't do it, you have some recourse. But if it is not written down, it did not happen. Unfortunately.
Someone commented that they got comp ed if someone didn't provide the minutes of service. I just want to explain what that is. So that's compensatory education. That is when the district has failed to provide something that is written in the IEP that the team has agreed to, that is in the IEP. Then you say, hey, my child only received X minutes of X therapy, either direct or consult this year. You owe me the difference, right? And then you come up with a monetary amount based on whatever your local, private provider would charge, and you get compensatory education money to use for that makeup service. So it's, again, not ideal, but it's a way to get some to hold their feet to the fire again, so they will hopefully continue, do the right thing the next time.
Right.
And one more question, and then I know you want to wrap up, but I'd like to get this question in. Sure. This person is saying they're going to the child's transferring from middle school to high school, and they disagree with so much on the IEP. Should they fight over the next 4 months to get the IEP better, or just go to the new school and take up that battle there? I'm curious your response about that, Julie.
What I would do was ask for an IEP meeting, a joint IEP meeting with the high school team and the middle school team, and make sure you're identifying the areas that you agree with and identifying the areas you don't agree with. So if I don't know if it's a service issue, or if they're telling you, well, your child's matriculating to high school, so they no longer need this because that's not how they do it in the high school. I promise you, if that's what they're saying, you remind them that the IEP is written for the child, not the placement. So you can tell them, well, that's good and fine that he's going to high school. We'll fight the scheduling issue when we get there. But what he needs is what goes in that IEP, not where he's at. And I hear that a lot between elementary, middle, and then middle and high school, that they don't do that at the next school. And I always say, well, it's good. We're not writing the IEP for the next school. We're writing the IEP for this kid. So we'll deal with the placement at that point.
Well, that's
I don't know if that answered the question.
Yeah, when we went through the anatomy of the IEP, we talked about how placement is always the very last decision. And so if you are talking about placement and you haven't gone through everything that the child needs, all the services and supports, you can't discuss placement because you don't know what the child needs until you've built the super robust IEP. Oh, you're about to talk about that. I stopped.
No, you're okay. It's perfect timing. So you're exactly right. So if they're talking about placement, I was just going to say that if they're talking about placement before you have agreed to every single thing in that IEP, you can say, I am thrilled that we're talking about placement, but right now we're going to make sure that everything else in this IEP is correct and that we're all in agreement. We've come to consensus, and then we can talk about placement. But again, just like everything else in the IEP, you are 100% a part of that discussion. So here it is right here. Must ensure that the parent is a member of the group that makes the decisions about your educational placement. You are as much a part of that conversation as any other part of the IEP. So a lot of times the dispute that I see is between the school wants the placement to change, or you want the place, or they want the placement to stay the same and you disagree. So that, it's one or the other. So if you want the placement to stay in place and they're saying your child is not making progress, so now we have to put them in a more restrictive environment, then the key things to remember are that you want to ask them what you would like to know is what services, accommodations, and modifications and supports were attempted, how long, and what was the data collected to ensure that that was happening, to answer the question that just came up, before considering a change of placement. So a lot of times they'll say, oh, Johnny's been here for 6 months and he's not making progress, so we're going to go ahead and move him to a self-contained classroom. However, they didn't have the one-to-one and aid in place, or they didn't give the accommodations with any kind of fidelity, or they didn't collect data to say whether he was making progress. They just felt like he wasn't, or they say, he doesn't seem like he's doing a good job. Those are the kinds of things that you want to say, you know what, I want black and white numbers. I want to see everything that was put in place, every support that he's been getting. And then I want to see the numbers that are saying that he's not making progress. And I think any reasonable person, if all of these things are in place and everybody's attempted everything with fidelity and he's not making progress, then any reasonable person would come to the conclusion that maybe it is the placement. But like Audrey just said, if none of that stuff is happening, placement should not even be a discussion. It should not be a discussion. The opposite, if we look at it backwards, if you want the placement to change because there's no progress, if you clearly as the parent feel like your child is not making progress, then you're going to ask the exact same question. You want the data to support that this placement is appropriate. You want to say, you know what, because I have a school district here in Maryland that shall not be named that says we do full inclusion. That's what we do here. So every child gets to sit in the general ed class. And a lot of times I say to them, but that's not appropriate because this particular child needs a more restrictive environment, right? We're having the opposite argument. They need to be in a more restrictive environment so that they can access their curriculum. So again, you want to see the data, and you want to, and you would say that based on this data, once you see the data that they're not meeting those goals, or that it's been 6 months and nobody's even attempted a goal with your child yet, which is absurd to me. Then you can say that despite all of the goals that we've written, despite all of the supplementary aids and services, despite the modifications, my child still is not making progress. Now is the time to look at placement, right? Yeah. So it's kind of the opposite there.
Can I add something about data? You talk a lot about data, and I think data is a scary word to a lot of parents. You as a parent can collect data and present it to the team.
Yep.
So your data might be, at the end of the day, my child comes home and completely falls apart and cries and screams, or goes to bed and sleeps for 12 hours, or whatever is happening at home. Data could be, I did a school training for an IEP team, and they said, this child has a behavior problem. Every time he comes into the classroom, he puts his head down on the desk, and then he makes an excuse to go to the school nurse. And he had never been assessed for a central auditory processing disorder, and he was in a classroom of 40 kids. So it was like he was going to a rock concert to learn math. And so I said, well, you can't. And they wanted to understand what was the difference between medical and behavior. And there is no difference in our kids, by the way. That's the little secret, right? Because everything that happens with them is based on the brain basis of their condition. And so once the team understood that and did a proper assessment and put supports in place for him, suddenly that wasn't happening anymore. So that was a data point. I didn't actually go in the classroom. I never met the student, right? So what data are you sharing with the team that is, maybe it is anecdotal. Maybe you're recording your child at home performing a task or not performing a task that the school is claiming to see.
That's data.
Bring that with you to the IEP meeting and saying, here's my data. My data says that he can do this or he can't do this, right? Let's talk about what I'm seeing at home and what's different about the setting, the pacing, the time of day, how the approach, whatever it is that we could replicate or not in this home setting, right? So, yeah.
Yep. And your data is equal to the data that they are providing at the school because you're an equal member of the team. So you have to remember that. And this is the website that you want to look at in regards to placement, for placement decisions for an IEP. So there's a couple more. Last one is access. And this is one that comes up a lot with our kids because your children have IEPs. I'm assuming that most people on the call, their children have IEPs. A lot of times schools say, well, they have an IEP, but because your child has these disabilities, we cannot include them in these activities in school. I had one recently that they said this exact, he cannot go on the field trip because they don't have the staff to support, it was the child's mobility needs. Okay. So you can keep your child home that day, or they can come in and they can color with a grade below them because the kid was in 5th grade and 4th graders weren't going on the field trip. So what the law says is your children are also covered under the American with Disabilities Act, which is section 504. Your children may not have 504 plans. A lot of schools say, well, if they have an IEP, they don't also have a 504 plan, which I can make peace with because a lot of the accommodations and the modifications are in the IEP. However, that does not mean that your child is not covered by the American with Disabilities Act and the non-discrimination clause. So if every 5th grader is going on this field trip and your 5th grader uses a wheelchair, I'm sorry that it might cost a little bit more to get the bus that has the wheelchair access, but they need to do that. They need to provide access to a bus for your child if they're doing it for any other child in the school. They cannot say simply because your child uses a wheelchair or simply because your child has behavioral impact or because your child has complex medical needs that they cannot go on this field trip. Now, they can call you and say, we're going to go to the zoo, and we know that your child has extreme anxiety about animals. Let's talk about that. Do you want your child to go on the field trip? Is there a way we can get your child on the field trip in a safe and healthy way? But they cannot say arbitrarily because your child has anxiety, which is a disability protected under American with Disabilities Act, that your child can't go. They can't say, if they say, like Audrey's example of the central auditory processing, if we're going to a really crowded and loud basketball game and all the 5th graders are going, they can't say because your child has central auditory processing disorder and they have an IEP for it, they can't go because we don't have the staff to take them out if they need a break. That's not acceptable. They need to find the staff to allow your child. They can have a discussion about your child with you and what makes sense, but they can't arbitrarily discriminate against them because of their disability. And I think this is something that gets lost in the sauce a lot with schools. It's that they say, because they have an IEP, they're not covered with American with Disabilities Act, and that's completely false. The other one that I see a lot is we don't have enough staff to watch your child on the playground, so you pick them up early every Wednesday when we go to the playground. Again, not acceptable because they're being discriminated against because all their classmates are out there on that playground. They need to provide support because they're being discriminated against if they're taken out. So that's something, a violation of civil rights, which is a whole different law than the IEDEA. And I think it's something that families need to be aware of when schools are asking them to do things different simply because your child has a disability. And this is sort of speaks to that. I know we're kind of running out of time. This sort of speaks to what you can say. And often I say to families, tell them, I'm happy to work with you to figure out a solution, but if you're offering it to everybody, you're offering it to my child, and we just need to figure out how to make that happen. Now that there's a little clause that says administrative decisions are not covered. So if the rule is in the school that a child that's involved in a physical altercation cannot go on the field trip because of a discipline issue, and your child gets into a fist fight the day before the field trip, he's not covered. That's the rule. You can't go if you're in the field trip, if you're in fighting. So I don't think that's an issue for these guys, but just so you know.
Yeah. There's a question in the chat that I think is important. This parent was told by the school nurse that they couldn't provide a place for my child to rest after a seizure during his post-ictal period because she was only one person and couldn't leave him alone. They said they would have to call us and come home for the day rather than give him 20 to 30 minutes to rest in a quiet place. She said she was the only RN there and it would be a danger for him to be alone. How would you respond to that, Julie?
That is not acceptable. And I'll tell you why, because if your child goes home, say he has a seizure at 9 a.m. and he has to go home, he is missing his instructional period that afternoon. And he's missing it not because he needs the entire afternoon to rest. He's missing it because they don't have the supervision to watch him for 30 minutes or however long during his postictal period. So I would say that now the first time that happens and they say we're going to send him home, that doesn't constitute a change of placement. But if your child has frequent seizures and this is an issue that happens more often, frequently, then that can rise to the level of a change in placement. Basically saying that you're missing your access to general ed or special ed services because your child has a disability. If any child is allowed to lay down in the nurse's station for 30 minutes, your child is allowed to do it, period. Whether he has a seizure or not. That's ADA. And if I go back to that slide real quick, right here, look this up. Go look at that website right there and it's going to talk about that.
I'll be sending the slides out after today.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's a lot of information, I know. I apologize.
All right, I'm going to end the recording, but if anyone wants to stay on for any questions, hang on, I'm just going to pause the recording. Thank you all for being here today.